Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the penultimate session, I believe, of this energizing, wonderful, stimulating conference. I'm sorry I was a few seconds late, but this is ALC. We have to do several things at the same time. Unlike Cyril, I insist I was democratically appointed and elected. From that particular point, anyway, I wouldn't sort of hold up the session. We would move to the session. We have three presentations. The first on the South African development community's approach to peace and security, a lost ball in I-Weeds by Professor Hendricks. The second presentation is on France defense and security policies in its former African colonies, new challenges, same framework, by Professor Boubacar Ndiaye. And the third presentation from Dr. Mshai is on East African society and regional security issues and programmatic proposals. Their biographies are in the program, so I will not go into great detail about that. I will just invite Professor Hendricks. And the ground rule is 15-minute presentation, and I'll smile at you.
Thank you, but I think I kept quiet for the past 2 days. I'm going to indulge myself with a few extra minutes. Thank you to the ALC for inviting me here today, and especially to this conference where you have been recognizing and honoring for me, whom I am privileged, I'm proud to say, as a friend, a sister, a mentor, and a colleague. I think in the few years that I've known from you, and it's not long, it's about 3 years, I have, among other things, learned to use the word conversation. We don't have lectures and addresses and declarations anymore. We have conversations, right? And I think this represents an approach or an engagement, an interaction which is non-descriptive, non-judgmental, and which is critically reflective then, for us collectively. So this thing too is what I would like to do today, have a conversation about SADC's approach to peace and security, which is not that different from other regional security organizations' approaches. So it's a conversation about conceptualizations of peace and security in Africa. I use the process of reflecting on the development of SIPO 2 and of reviewing SIPO 1, the strategic indicative plan of the organ, as an entry point to show that we as academics or researchers haven't really made an impact on these plans, that we have a disjuncture in the discourse and practice on peace and security, and that instead of only pointing fingers at the securocrats, we should also look at our own role in the perpetuation of this state-centric perspective. For those of us who try to follow what the SADC organ does, the process of developing SIPO 2 was important because we really thought we could make a difference, and we all submitted our contributions, etc. I remember going to collect civil society's approaches to peace and security, etc., and giving it to them, but nothing happened. The new plan was adopted in SADC in 2010 and launched only 2 years later in Arusha in 2012. That must itself indicate some kind of tension there. So I argue that SIPO 2 amounted to little more than a managerial and technical revision of the first SIPO. We lost an important moment where we could bring a change in our conceptualizations of peace and security to SADC, so we thought. But SADC's inability to generate new thinking on peace and security is reflective, I argue, of a global cul-de-sac that we seem to have reached in our discourse and practice. It is 20 years since the UNDP heralded a more comprehensive view of security encapsulated in this notion of human security, although the realist approach to peace and security was long critiqued by liberals, by critical security studies, by feminists, etc. It was that human security approach that gained traction, and that approach drew on these other critiques. The human security approach enabled a shift in our conceptual gaze from threats to freedom, so freedom from fear, freedom from want. I think that though the intellectual shift produced by the human security approach was far-reaching, those traditionally charged with decision-making on and the provision of security have done little to alter existing power relations or to move from conceptualization of states as reference and actors of securities. We have not seen a transformation in the security sector. The traditional conceptualizations may no longer hold validity, but the new have not taken root either. So SADC's organ on politics, defense and security was created at the height of these debates on human security in the 1990s. And we see little nuggets of the human security approach in the SADC organ's objectives, but little in terms of its implementation is what I basically argue. Despite consistent critique, it has not deviated from its male-centric status perspectives of security. So now we have blamed 9/11, etc. for this, but I think if we take a more introspective look, explanations for the continued dominance of state security perspectives can equally be found in the disconnect between the locus of security thinking, academic institutions, think tanks, research institutions, etc., and those who have to implement it, traditional state security institutions. The ability of the center, the traditional or realist security approaches, to absorb those human security approaches without having to radically transform themselves. An equally skewed and binary focus of critical theory approaches from the state to the individual, from state actors to non-state actors, from established security challenges to new security challenges. And many of you have noted these binaries already. So the end result is a situation in which either the new challenges became securitized or security issues are bifurcated with freedom from want hived off to the development sector and non-state actors, and freedom from fear to the security sector. That is basically what has happened. So in essence, the discourse changing, but in practice, the locus and responsibility remaining unchanged. So those are the kinds of traps and complacency that I think we also find in SADC security thinking. And I say we need to ask ourselves, have scholars and practitioners produced the appropriate diagnosis of and prescriptions for the continent's security challenges? Have sufficiently robust mechanisms, processes, and interventions been advanced, or have we been papering over very critical issues, producing frameworks, declarations, resolutions that in turn produce these very staid interventions that we are seeing? Have critical theorists produced viable alternatives to the current provision of security, or merely critiqued it? Bar mantra, or almost stock response, for a shift from state-centric perspectives, for civil society and women's groups to be included into security decision-making, for bottom-up approaches, we have not gone very far in our rethinking on peace and security. And we have not produced sustainable security for the majority of our citizens. And if we want to seriously do this, we need to be thinking very differently about security. I don't think we're there yet. My paper is certainly not there yet, but I do think that this is where we need to be. How do we disrupt our present-day political and institutional logic so that we can create a new discourse around this? Because we still, I think, conveniently thinking in terms of interstate, intrastate actors, and we can define it as state actors, non-state actors, but essentially still the same. And our responses of peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building for the last 20 years, we've almost been trapped in that, okay? If I turn to SADC, and I'm certainly not going to give you a whole long history of the development of SADC, I do want to point out that part of why SADC has kind of remained trapped in the status perspective is because of the way in which it developed as well through the frontline states, dealing with issues of decolonization, the Cold War, national independence, etc. So the context almost predetermines its state-centric, militaristic, and boys' club approach, even though, and I must say this, Fatoko, even though it sometimes includes a few girls, post-1992, as ministers of intelligence, defense, etc. And then we had Joyce Banda for a very brief period in Malawi. If we look at the way in which both the SADC double C, as in the Coordination Conference established in '81, and SADC as the Southern Africa Development Community established in 1992, the way in which they try to bring development and peace and security together was simply in terms of the objectives. In terms of implementation, they were quite separate in their institutional logic. And so we had, for example, the SADC organ being formed to deal with peace and security with its own SIPO development plans, and then we had all your development sectors dealing with the RISDP plan. So very separate logic there that cannot bring the kind of transformation that we have been saying we want for SADC. What I tried to look at then were some of the kinds of accomplishments and challenges that we indicated when we reviewed SIPO2, and I was part of that review process, so I'm in a sense critiquing myself as well as doing this. But I think if we look at the kinds of issues we were dealing with, I'm going to skip a whole lot and simply get to that. For the political sector, we indicated that SADC had made substantial progress in terms of political governance because it adopted the principles for conducting democratic elections, the framework, right? So the substantive, I mean, I look back at it now and I feel quite silly, but that's what we said. The SADC organ was also able to respond to conflicts in the region through the deployment of Track 1 mediators in Lesotho, DRC, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, etc. We critiqued it for not engaging the public sufficiently, for no attention to DDR and SSR, etc., the conventional stuff. Essentially what we did was a gap analysis, right? Here's your SIPO 1. This is what you said you were going to do. This is what you actually done. And so this is where your faults are. We did not question the approach and the assumptions embedded in that particular plan at all. We certainly didn't question why the organ didn't have Swaziland on the agenda, why it didn't deal with issues such as service delivery protests in South Africa, how they were negotiating the thorny issue of sovereignty and the right to protect, for example. None of those issues were part of that review process at all. When I look and I say, what about the current political arrangement in Madagascar that SADC mediated is going to prevent another coup in Madagascar from taking place? We brought two personality cults together, we had this election take place, and so what? What else needed to be done there? How is it that we make sense of an election in Zimbabwe that now legitimizes ZANU-PF's rule without addressing the issues that gave rise to the backlash against ZANU-PF in the first place? Has that been addressed? How did SADC rest at a place in which elections, no matter what the outcome or the marker for the transition to peace, security, and democracy, I guess, is a bigger question there. When we look at the defense sector, and I guess this is a point that I want to make, SADC's progress is mostly the SADC organ I'm talking about, right? Mostly in terms of the defense sector. And so we can point to the standby brigade, the mutual defense back, the regional peacekeeping training center, etc. And when we highlight our challenges, it's about lack of interoperability, lack of funding, etc. There's no questioning why we have to establish a planning element to further separate within the SADC organ the military dimension from the political dimension, for example. There's no questioning of, do we need this kind of brigade to deal with the issues that SADC itself had highlighted as its challenges, which, when you read the SIPA document, is HIV, AIDS, corruption, all of those kinds of issues. Even though the SADC brigade was called for by the African Union, we didn't even question the assumptions about peacekeeping or peace enforcement. Okay? For policing, exactly the same thing. For conflict prevention also, we don't question what is it that within SADC conflict prevention is simply reduced to early warning. There's nothing around building of peace infrastructures or anything like that. And particularly within SADC, the conflict prevention or early warning system is run by the intelligence sector, which is also why it has its problem in being kick-started. I guess what I'm saying is we really haven't gotten to the space where we're dealing with the basic human security needs of the population in Southern Africa. Those local level challenges where we have to be at. I'm going to skip a whole lot here because I know you are looking at me. So I'm going to go straight to my conclusion, which is one that SIPO2, big launch, much to do about nothing. The more things change, the more they stay the same. When you read SIPO2, exactly the same challenges that were in SIPO1, written in 2004, find themselves in SIPO document in 2010 when it is produced. No questioning about, well, we are in SIPO2 proposing to do exactly the same thing, have exactly the same responses to those challenges which the first plan did not address. So no kind of rethinking there. To conclude then, Southern Africa is home to some of the most unequal societies in the world, such as South Africa, Namibia, and Angola. 6 of the 20 poorest countries in the world are located in Southern Africa: DRC, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Madagascar, Mozambique, and Comoros. 2 countries vie for the position of rape capital of the world. I won't name them. The recent Marikana massacre sent shockwaves through the continent and beyond. It not only highlighted the old racial and class divisions, but also the continued brutality of the police force, the violent reconfiguration of labor struggles, and the uneasiness of the coexistence of tradition and modernity. It is a region, I think, of very profound contradictions that we really are not grappling with. And so any organization like SADC that purports to be dealing with peace and security has to be cognizant of these challenges and has to develop comprehensive strategies of redress and not the kind of formulaic responses to peace and security that we have been seeing thus far. So we haven't made those organic links that Cyril was referring to. SADC hasn't made them. African Union, I don't think, has made them. Neither has the UN, and that is why I say SADC is a lost ball in the high weeds, which basically implies a bit directionless at the moment. Thank you.
I was about to make a joke regarding slumber after a particularly good meal, but after that very energetic presentation, I think I'm going to keep that joke to myself. But I do hope that she woke you up enough that you will indulge me for 15 minutes. Chair, I will make sure that I don't get beyond that. All right. Clearly, Francophone Africa is not a region, but it is, without a doubt, a conceptual category that is worth taking a look at in terms of security if we want to understand the globality of the security situation in which we find ourselves as a continent. And maybe to emphasize the importance of France and its relations with its former colonies and with the continent as a whole, one only needs to consider the following. Suddenly, after Boko Haram made the infamous abduction of those girls, the closest link between Yaoundé and Abuja became Paris. When really it became shorter to go to Paris than to fly from Yaoundé to Abuja. And of course that shows you the importance of France, which decides, its president decides that, well, Boko Haram is an important issue for these two countries, so you come to Paris to talk to me about it. And of course, before that, in December of 2013, France did summon, literally, African leaders who obliged to Paris to talk about security on the continent. If only for these two examples, you should understand that to understand the problem of security on the continent, you do need to go there. Well, this has not started just yesterday. In 1981, an Israeli scholar called Tamar Golan, who is now dead, wrote an article titled as follows: "A certain mystery. How can France do all it does and get away with it?"
That's a joke.
It's really the title of an article.
The joke you wanted to share.
No. I kept that one. So France was then the gendarme de l'Afrique, meaning the policeman of the continent. And I'll submit to you that 30 odd years later, this has not changed. Clearly the world has changed. France itself has changed. African countries, African Francophone countries have changed. The entire world has changed. But certain things just remain the same, as Cheryl just told us. A few months back, Laurent Gbagbo found himself in The Hague, and he said, well, I was arrested under the bombs of the French, and my palace was surrounded by French tanks. And of course, when you see that, you can't help remembering that question that Tamar asked a generation ago. And of course, you all know that France did participate very actively in killing, let's call it by its name, killing Gaddafi and ransacking his country. So to understand, again, let me repeat it, to understand the security of this continent, security issues, you do need to focus also on the role of France. So what is the framework of the relationship between France and its former colonies? It started just about at the end of the colonial era. When France discovered that it could no longer keep its colonies, it devised literally a system as far as security and defense were concerned to ensure that its interests will be kept after independence. In designing Francophone countries' armies, it designed them as literally units of the overall French army to defend French interests in the continent. That was the conceptual framework of the relations between Africa and its former colonies in particular. And that framework also entailed signing agreements with these former colonies, defense and security agreements, with secret clauses that nobody was supposed to know, with actually authorization for France to intervene signed already by the head of state of some key African countries in case France needed to intervene without their being here to give that authorization. And part of that arrangement also was these African countries buying French weaponry, almost in exclusivity, and also giving priority access to France to some strategic minerals. Part of that arrangement was France's intervention at will for at least 2 generations. You take the example of Leomba, who basically was overthrown. France put him back because Gabon was too important. And then, of course, more recently, Côte d'Ivoire, but in the 1970s and 80s, France basically intervened at will. Now, let me skip a good chunk of time and come into the years 2000. When Sarkozy was elected, he came to Pretoria, is it Cape Town? Cape Town in February 2008, and said, well, that kind of framework cannot continue. We are in 2008, and it's not 1960, 1970, we have to change that. He said, I am going to change entirely this framework. And François Hollande, when he came after him, did not make that grandiose kind of statement, but also said, well, we'll change that framework. So we can ask, did that change or not? At the end of the presentation, I'll give a few examples to illustrate whether or not they were able to change anything at all. So let me go back again to the 1990s. 1990s, things changed. 89, the end of the Cold War, the world completely changed. 1990, La Baule Conference. La Baule Conference is that annual France-Afrique conference in which François Mitterrand, then president, said, well, the Cold War has ended, maybe we don't need you guys as much, so now we are going to tie our help to you democratizing. And what is referred to as the La Baule Doctrine, as I just explained it, was supposed to change things already. But of course, that was not necessarily the case. And business as usual really continued because France was facing a major contradiction. Can you preach, on the one hand, democracy and all those good things, and at the same time keep a framework that safeguarded your interests? You have to choose one over the other. And of course, sure enough, after La Baule conference, 2 other conferences were held, one in Biarritz and the other in Libreville, and France basically backtracked, essentially told its former colonies, well, guess what? If you have to choose between development, democracy, and security, you forget about the 2 first ones. You just stick to security. Then Prime Minister Beregova told them that. So, double talk. And again, the importance for France was to make certain that regardless of what happens, its interests were safeguarded. And then, of course, came 1994. What was 1994? That was the genocide. France overreached. And again, that changed a lot of things. But constantly, France was, as Guy Martin, who wrote extensively on these things, tried to kind of have some creative ambiguity about its relations with Francophone Africa and the continent in particular. It coined the phrase and a cohabitation government. Well, cohabitation is this concept in the French political system where you have a French president from the right, typically, and a prime minister from the left, and they basically have, as a marriage couple, try to find a compromise to live out their married life until the next election. During that cohabitation that started, particularly the one between Chirac and, what's the name of that prime minister? Forgot the name. It's come to me. Huh? No, not Mitterrand. I'm sorry? Not Villepin. No. It's gosh, I'm blanking on his name. It come to me. Oh gosh, huh? No. Okay, it come to me. Basically, they coined the phrase neither nor. So, neither intervention as in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, nor indifference. Again, French are very creative, you have to give them that. So, basically, they said, well, intervening as we did in the 1960s and 70s just would not cut it. The world has changed too much. But we cannot either let things go to the point where we do not assert our interest. Say, well, we will not intervene in some instances, but in some others we will. For example, in Côte d'Ivoire in 1999, the reason why Bédier was not saved by France was because during that cohabitation, the prime minister socialist said, well, we don't intervene. Chirac wanted to intervene and they did not, and the coup succeeded. So basically, that was an approach that France came up with in the 1990s. And then, again, French are very creative folk. They say, well, what we may need to do is to Africanize our interventions, particularly when the Americans came with the ACRI and the ACOTA schemes to say, well, we cannot intervene. What we're going to do is to prepare Africans themselves, to train them and to equip them so that they can intervene, and so our boys will not go and die in crises. Certainly, we would like to avoid Rwanda, but we do not want to intervene. So the French basically created RECAMP, which is a program which mirrored what the Americans did. Say, well, we are going to train African militaries. We are going to have some agreements for actually annual maneuvers and training with regional organizations so that we cannot intervene directly. We don't have to intervene directly. So the Africanized intervention. And then multilateralized intervention also. Meaning, well, we do have, for example, troops positioned in Côte d'Ivoire. If we must intervene, we make sure that it is under international mandate. We go to the United Nations Security Council, we get a resolution, and we intervene under that mandate. Well, we intervene because our interests are at stake, but it is under the flag of the United Nations. Or, more recently, under the flag of the European Union. So France asserts its right basically to intervene, but it does so under the cover of either some agreement with Africans themselves or under the banner of the United Nations or the European Union, as they did in Chad and in Central African Republic. Now, then came Chirac. After the left lost and the right was totally in charge, there was no cohabitation, Chirac energized a little bit the old French intervention proclivities. So, in 2004, for example, when he was confronted by mobs in Abidjan, he intervened without a UN mandate. He went, for example, and bombed the air force of Gbagbo. There was no mandate there. But then he put Licorne and the UN mandate. Two minutes. All right. Quickly, recamp. What's the problem with recamp? Recamp is basically equip and train, but absolutely no change in the security arrangement that exists. For example, no transformation of the security system that France has put in place for a long time. And then quickly to the 2000s. When Sarkozy came into power, he said, well, I am going to change that. There's actually a word for this kind of relation I just described quickly called France-Afrique. This is an unsavory type of relationship, incestuous relationship between Francophone African elite and French elite. An illustration of that was that in the middle of the years 2000, there were tons of cash carried in drums from African capitals to finance French elections. So that is the kind of relation that France-Afrique refers to. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. But Sarkozy came and went to Pretoria, again to Cape Town. He said, well, this absolutely has to change. Because he said, well, I am of a generation that is born after the independence years, and I don't have any relation with the old class of French politicians who carry this kind of business. And he said, well, I am going to change it. Well, he could not. One of his ministers who very boldly said, well, I'm going to sign the act of death of France-Afrique, because his name is Jean-Marie Bockel. The next thing he knew, Bongo and Sassou and others came to visit Sarkozy and said, well, look, we don't want this guy, and he got out of there. Now, a few examples to illustrate what is it that changed really, even after the statement by Sarkozy that we are going to change things. Chad, 2008. Déby was surrounded by rebels about to knock him over. The French sent their aircraft to bomb the rebel columns and basically saved Déby's regime, because clearly Déby is their friend and is in their camp. Ivorian crisis. Sarkozy is a friend of Ouattara, and he helped him big time to take power. Now, it doesn't mean that Ouattara didn't win fair and square, and that Gbagbo is not a thug, a political thug, but the reality is that French-African relations played a major role in settling that. Mauritania, 2008, a military coup overthrows the only democratically elected president. Everybody clamors, it has to be reversed. The AU, everybody. France also. But as it was saying that, it was negotiating with the coup leader to have some military, French military stations in the north of the country, and to sign some agreement for the Total, which is the oil company of France. So nothing has changed there. Well, this is the time where someone is calling me on Skype. Unbelievable. Yes. All right. 1 minute, please. The Mali crisis. The Mali crisis, clearly France intervened. Now it was asked to intervene, and thanks God it did. But again, it's the same kind of scheme that it was under. And as it intervened, it made certain that it kept the rebel movement under its wing, so that it can have the kind of leverage that it needs on the Malian government. So, well, I'm going to skip the Sahel part of this, but all in all, not much has changed. But let me read, and indulge me 1 minute to read a very short reaction by a scholar of Franco-African relations. He said, well, so how should African react when the French president tells them, well, we are going to change things? He said, well, quote, they should take Sarkozy's deceptive and insensitive talk of a rupture, of a departure in French African policy only as the same wine in a different bottle. In fact, just as a pathetic facade for a hasty and self-interested redecoration of neocolonialism. In the words of a former French diplomat with long experience in African affairs, articulated during an informal chat with the author of this comment, he said, how foolishly could any French president implement a genuine policy that would get France's relations, incestuous relations with Africa on a sounder footing and, by default, risk losing a chasse gardée, that is hunting ground, which was built by the sweat of the de Gaulle, of Foucault, and which still is both a psychological source of grandeur, that is, of glory, and a time-tested prize with immeasurable political, military, financial, and economic benefits. End of quote. This is a good place for me to stop. Thank you very much. Prime Minister's name is Lionel Jospin.
Thank you, Chief. In Kiswahili, we have a concept that we call bakshish, which is borrowed from the Arabic. I'm sure a number of you are familiar with. I'm very happy to see Fumi is the one who is first to nod, because I'm saying that to say that this is where we return to the first shift celebration of Fumi in a little way, after she thought we were done. So I'm really happy that you understand the concept of bakshish, which is just a little bit more over, you know, of something that you had planned and you had, you know, you pay for something, then you get an extra tomato, that kind of thing. Yeah. Yes. So this is a bit of a bakshish. In fact, we just thought that one of the things we wanted to do in closing up this part of the conference was to go back and look at what Fumi's influence has been very much at some of the programs that we're doing at ALC through a particular program that we're beginning. I think very much going to that theme that we were saying, Fumi is not gone, she's here. Her spirit continues to go. And as part of that, also just remembering what Zida said on the evening when we were having the celebration, and said, no, actually it was yesterday morning, when she said, we all did it together, but somebody offers leadership. So I will be referring very much to just some of the ways in which Fumi's influence has shaped it, bearing in mind that we all did this together. And I really do mean this literally, because the program I'm representing, I think practically everybody who's been part of it is here. So I hope I do speak for everyone. And I'll do the thing that they say, the mistakes are mine, but you know, we all did it together. And I hope my leader will not push me off the bus or the train or whatever it is she's leading us on. I do want to just quickly reference, I'll keep going back to these four, but four of the things, and I think we've heard them again and again and again from that first evening, was, I just want to reference, I think Godwin said this, was we will keep, you know, here are the things that we will keep carrying on. And we've talked about leadership, and I think, Fumi, when you spoke yesterday, you talked at length about leadership as influence and what that meant. And then what Cheryl just referenced, the spaces of conversation. I heard a big discussion between two fellows who will remain nameless. And the argument was, did she say conversible spaces? Did she say conversing spaces? It had something to do with conversation, was the way it ended. But those spaces of conversation, and what does it mean to truly have a space of conversation that isn't just about somebody talking down to others, but also is about having exchanges that influence people's direction. I am reminded about a month ago, we had a workshop with the media, with and we're trying to start this relationship of nurturing a new generation of media, well, at least a group of media that will grow with us. And one of the things that we did was we had a breakout session on, I always wanted to work with scholars, and that was the one session that nobody wanted to go into. I actually had to go to groups and pull people out. And, I remember going to Boubacar Zains and saying, you must have this relationship with scholars. And it was just a fear of working with scholars, saying, they talk, we don't understand them, they know too much, all sorts of things. So also thinking about how do we demystify that conversation. And then the sense would be also I want to draw from is this, Fumi's been, and I know this is something that has grown through involvement in other spaces, but the working group methodology. And a very specific thinking through how do you do mentoring even as you're doing work, and how does that mentoring happen in different spaces. And I think it was said by some of the people who spoke to some of the ways that Fumi mentors in a way that it's, you sometimes, she's learning as well as giving. There's that sense of peer mentoring. And then for my presentation, I think the thing that I know I'm celebrating with Fumi as I do this is invoking that community of intellectuals. I think it was Ebon the first day who said, if you just look around the room, or was it Bio? The fact that Fumi's brought in so many people, and she herself referenced this sense of a community of intimacy, of intellectuals where you cross-fertilize each other's ideas. And I want to say that because all through my paper, all I'll be doing is I'll say, this particular idea, remember so-and-so, as a way of also demonstrating how that works. Always bearing in mind that I think it is Fumi V who said, when she was talking yesterday, of how easily it is for somebody's idea to get lost, so that 3 or 4 decades later, we're all talking about this thing that we all know, but we forget to credit. And that's part of the things that we need to do in terms of amplifying what Africans are doing and our contribution to even global discourses in different areas. And I just want to say this, that I'm a performance scholar. So I came into this field literally with fear and trembling. And I think my first meetings, I always would say, I'm not really one of you, but. And it's been the gradual coming in. One of the things I'm really, really fascinated about is how knowledge is created, how it's shaped, how it's passed on, how it is used. And so this conversation is very much looking from the outside to seeing how a particular project, which is about a relationship between a policy, if you like, institution and a space of an academic institution, how that becomes a nurturing thing. And I want to go back to something that Cheryl ended, and I just thought, oh my goodness, that it is true that we often feel that way, like depressed, we don't know where this is going, we've come to the end of it. But also to ask, if I may borrow from Wangari Maathai, can we be the hummingbird who might say, just in my little way, I am doing what I can. So it is also a space of looking at what is ALC doing, the little I am doing what I can and what that means. And then another thing I just want to say, I came back to this country from grad school in 2007. 2 weeks after I came back, the country that I thought, I was coming to change kind of disintegrated, and we're wondering for a while if we even had a country, and started changing me. That's very true. And sometime in mid-2008, I went on 1 week to 2 back-to-back forums that have completely changed my thinking, and perhaps even have influenced myself easing into this area without my realizing it. The first one was a forum. It was a Kwani. Those of you who don't know, Kwani is, perhaps our most cutting-edge publishing house. Very much, Kwani in Swahili means so, what are you going to do about it? That kind of thing. And they're very much in your face, and they really revitalized the publishing industry here. And they had a festival, and they were talking in one particular panel, which is their keynote panel, what happened? How did Kenya burn and we didn't even see it coming? And I remember the phrase that they kept using is, we are the intellectuals of the society. How come we missed it? And I sat there and I thought, okay, and these are all writers. They're not, very few of them are academics. Then the very next day, and I think Godwin was in that workshop with me, I was at a DAD workshop. DAD is the German Scholars Alumni. And I think we had 10 papers in that particular gathering. And everybody started by saying, I predicted this was going to happen. And then the question came, if you predicted it, why didn't anybody know? And everybody said, I presented it at this academic conference, or it is in this academic journal. And it just suddenly became very clear to me as a performance scholar that we needed to find this space of disconnect. And so what I'm going to address myself to is something that ALC is doing to address that space of disconnect. And I know a number of you are doing things, and it would be lovely to hear back from you in terms of what else we can do. I want to also reference a project that has been happening here in partnership with the SSRC, the African Peace Building Network. You can't see it now, but if you go outside and look beyond the tent, you'll see a bright blue building, and that's the APN Hub, the African Peace Building Network Hub. And I work with that program at ALC. And I want to reference this also in relationship to FUMI, because from when I joined ALC, one thing FUMI has always been very strong on is that it's about partnerships. You cannot do everything on your own. It's not about competing with each other. It's not about who gets the credit, even though it is important to know who is doing what, but working together. And last year, in particular, we had a reference research working group on leadership and peace building. And just very quickly, three of the things we looked at was the question of leadership, and therefore that definition Fumi was using, what does it mean when we say leadership is influence, not position, not charisma, and all the rest of that, made me to, we started to think, using what was coming out of that, and asking ourselves, how does that shape the other projects we are doing? So from the thematic paper on leadership, asking who is influencing discourses on peace, security, conflict, peace building, all the things we're talking about, and thinking of it in terms of institutions as well as individuals, who is informing these discourses, and how can we make sure that African intellectual discourse is being amplified in those, if you want, the spaces of conversation, so that people are able to reference them wherever they are. We also looked at that particular thinking on that strand was led by Fumi. Eka led the thinking on the regional approaches, and very much that focus last year was on the EWS, the early warning systems. I was the person asking, what does a REC? You know, whispering in case nobody noticed I didn't know. What's EWS? Because there were all these things being thrown around. And so it made us start to think, what is the space of regional institutions? And amongst us, we had the East African community, since we were here, and you heard from me being told yesterday she's now an East African of Nigerian descent, and that was part of where that relationship began being hammered out. And then under Godwin, we looked at non-institutional approaches, and very much asking, this focus with the official, if you like, the state institutions. There was huge debate about whether we should even be using that term. But again, we were talking about how do we move to this society-centered? What else is happening out there that sometimes is off the radar? And then we went into extensive discussion to ask, these papers we are producing, so what, you know? After it's come out of, you know, can we take a paper? And we actually had a session where we looked at how does this go into further research? How does this go into curriculum? So people actually looked at each paper and said, I would teach this at this level, and this is how we would do it. But I think also importantly, the question somebody asked, I'm trying to remember who this morning, and asked, so what does that mean? Maybe it's Cheryl again, when you ask, what is it for policy when you are being a discussant? What are the implications for policy? And we looked at what are the implications for policy. I also remember at an APN grantees workshop, Fumi doing a session on turning research into policy briefs, and people admitting that many of them were saying, I've never even tried to do that. So what we ended up doing, and as the discussion went on, to bring it to ESC, and then I'll talk about the partnership, one of the ESC people who were there brought up the issue of parliamentary diplomacy, and we all got very excited. I think both Cyril and Fumi immediately said, we're going there next year. So I'm saying that to talk about the way that we craft partnerships, to take it into spaces, and that space of conversation that we began talking about yesterday. And this led to the signing of an MOU, and so we began our adventure in asking how an academic institution and a policy institution can come together. The rest of the next section of the paper, I'm not going to go into detail. I look at the two institutions. What is it that ALC stands for? Why does ALC then want to go into these partnerships? Very quickly, I'll talk about the East African Legislative Assembly, because the question then came, if you want to work in this region, you've got many options. I think even when we talked about EWS, we're looking at IGAD, for example, as another institution If we look at the East African community, even though it is one big community, you have different organs within it. And in the paper, I look at all the other different organs, the summit, the Council of Ministers, the East African Court of Justice, and why it is that we finally focused on East African Legislative Assembly. I won't go into details, but somebody, I think it was you beautifully talked about how it was important to look at the history of what some of these regional organizations, and very much for the East African community, bearing in mind that this is the second coming, so to speak, and that we were a community first in the 60s. And I think it's not accidental that there is a committee called the Regional Affairs and Conflict Resolution Committee, because we broke apart in 1977, and I think there's been this thing, I'm always thinking, how do we make sure we stay together? How do we make sure that this time there's not going to have to be the need for a third community? So the East African community prides itself on being very much people-driven. I think it's market-driven, but people-centered. And then also that the original EAC was the 3 countries of Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, and then Rwanda and Burundi came in, and now there's discussion about South Sudan, perhaps, all the other countries coming in. So all that, I go into that. And I won't talk, just because of time, we can go back to this, and I think we've got an able representation if people want to know what IALA actually does. But I also do want to emphasize that the thing about IALA that for us was interesting is IALA, if you look at its strategic plan, the new strategic plan for this particular assembly, this is the 3rd assembly ever since the East African Assembly was brought together. And this particular one have taken very deliberately a people-centered approach. That's the highlight of their strategic plan. And then also that their mandate is a representative, legislative oversight, and as came out from that discussion, also now they're very much willing and really interested in going into parliamentary diplomacy. So what we then did was, in terms of a project, and I won't go into the details, but we did come up with what do we want this project to be? What do we want it to look like? And just very quickly, we wanted to analyze the major societal transformations within societies in Eastern Africa, not just in East Africa, but to say we are influenced by what is going on around us, and then asking, if this has happened, what are the implications for security? Shadrach Nasongo beautifully did that yesterday, so I'm not going to go into that. We also wanted to look at the emerging narratives of security between the populations in the region and the government. So looking at that disconnect we've been talking about all along. And asking ourselves, we did a pilot study, for example, where we just asked citizens, what are you thinking most about? So being aware that if the Kenyan government right now has said people should not watch World Cup matches because our big fear is terrorism, a lot of women are saying, the last of my worries is if somebody is going to toss a grenade into a place at night. My biggest worry might be, can I walk home without getting raped? So looking at those disconnects. So people in Karamoja who would say their biggest concern is drought, it is not terrorism, okay? So looking at some of those disconnects. And then finally to ask how the emerging or transforming priorities find adequate responses in existing security architecture. And if it's not finding it, where are the disconnects and how we can help, how we can be part of that, the hummingbird. And so having had those discussions, and this was a period, I think earlier this year, we had several meetings with the IALA, just hammering out, what are your interests, what are our interests? And I think what I learned from that is that it is important to have that conversation, to listen to each other, to find out where you can find things that you both are mutually interested in. And then we finally agreed that we would also wanted to make recommendations that might facilitate IALA's capacity not only to legislate better, but also to influence security and peace-building initiatives through parliamentary diplomacy, which is where we began the conversation. So we did do, we've started on hopefully what is a long-term partnership. We signed an MOU with the speaker earlier on this year. But I just want to very briefly, as I come to an end, 2 minutes, talk about, we had a background paper that we presented. And I think what was interesting for me about the background paper was that in that background paper, it was possible for us, we talked about the 3 shifts. Shifts in terms of conceptual understanding, shifts in terms of what does it mean if you start to think not only about the institutions of the state and protecting their security, but also the security of the streets. And then shifts also in terms of How do you, what's the third one? There's a third shift. I'll come back to it. You just threw me off with that. But then also just coming to thinking about how we can, okay, so from thinking instead of just this approach of collective states, 5 states protecting security, to asking are there things we can do as a region that you cannot do from the collective of states approach. At the conference, we looked at 3 sides of insecurity, and we learned a lot. One of the things I was going to say yesterday, and I forgot, so I was just thinking of time, was again just teasing out things like definitions. So for example, I'm fascinated that Rwanda defines youth as those who are regarded as such by the community. I think that opens up amazing places to work that are different from the age-centered ones, which has been forced to by the African Protocol and the East African Protocol. We looked at borderlands, and it was interesting, I think Godwin was in that group, to see how people hold on to their stake on how that is defined and what it means. And then the natural resources, and East Africa is only waking up to some of the wonderful things you've talked about that we need to bear in mind in terms of oil and the rest of it. And then finally, flying in and doing a project, and then it ends as a consultancy and you go on. But thinking about how over several years, at least the life of this assembly, can we evolve this? And then also thinking about what we've been talking about, how do you continue to be as an institution an influencer, not just within the East African community or the legislators, but to other stakeholders, including the media, including the people, the notes that we ended up with, the women, the youth, everybody that we're talking to, who also have a stake and who also have aspirations that they need, they want to see actualized. Together, we're working on several products. For example, I'm just looking at the conference report, and for me, it's been interesting working with IALA to see how they do their conference report and see how we do a conference report, and then negotiating a conference report that we can both be happy with. We're looking at producing articles in all the spaces possible, from newspapers. For our conference, we had a young lady who's very interested in coming to conferences and then storyfying the discussion. So I'm learning to tweet as we do conferences, because that's how you're going to get to the youth. ALC has committed to thinking through these models, the model of the working group, but also the models such as this, to document the process, to see how we can learn from it. We have a policy paper, which I won't have time to go into, which we will publish as a separate policy paper, separate from the conference report. We will continue our training with media, and we got some amazing feedback. For example, only 2 women in the entire region applied for the workshop. And some of the discussion was that security is male. That's how many people understand it. So we're looking at how we can have training in those particular areas, expanding the understanding of security and so on. And then we have a book, and the book is going to have not only the paper that we presented, but also fleshing out the 7 sites of insecurity that we came up with. And I want to end, I think for me, what was very important for me was to see Fumi and Godwin insisting that chapters of that book will be co-authored by the quote research assistants. So we have a range of research assistants because we're trying to figure out how we do this. So, people who are working on their PhD, this is part of their thesis, to people who are just about coming into the research area, who are learning how to write a paper, how to look up the research, who are starting research on some of these areas, as well as to have some of the published, some of you will be contributing chapters to these areas. So I want to end by saying that for us, it becomes this journey on how we can learn to work with other people. And then finally, on Yala's point of view, and I'm just going to mention this, and perhaps if anyone is interested in the discussion time, I'm sure Zain, who is the chair of that committee, might want to talk a little bit more on this. Yala came up with a communique, or coming up with a communique. They're coming up with a resolution in the assembly directly from this. And then they're working on 3 pieces of legislation. One has already, we have the Peace and Security Protocol, for example, that has been passed, but only 2 states have ratified. So there's been push now through IALA to continue to get everybody else to ratify it. Then we'll talk about how do you roll it out, what do you do with that. There's also a new bill. Okay. The new bill, I'm finishing actually with this, the new bill that's coming up on public participation. Before that, there was only a bill on civic education, now asking, what does public participation, how do we create the structures? And finally, the Regional Affairs and Conflict Resolution Committee is now the Regional Affairs and Peace and Security Committee, and that was announced at the conference. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're at the 20 minutes to the end of the session mark. I'm going to call on Dr. Alao as a discussant. You have absolutely a maximum of 10 minutes. If you can do this less than that, we would all be grateful for the maximum.
I think one of the most difficult roles in academics really is what is actually the content of the job of a discussant? Is it to identify uncovered gaps or to summarize what the previous speakers have spoken? Regardless, whether it is A or B, I think my task is really very, very limited. When you are asked to come and discuss brilliantly presented papers, you can as well just come and say, I agree with everything they have said, and go back to your seat. But I'll just say one or two things. Cherly, thanks a lot for that. I've learned a lot from your presentation. But I think the one or two sentences I want to add to that is the fact that you can in a way understand where SADC is coming from. When you have to develop your security architecture outside pressure, you tend to be less innovative and you tend to take things easy. Unlike the case of ECOWAS that has to be developing its architecture with opportunities to cut and paste, to learn, to discard and everything, then it's the tendency to learn quickly becomes more paramount. So that's just what I want to add to what you have said. Boubacar, what France is doing is not new. We are in fact used to it. So I don't have anything to add to everything you have said. It's just a perfect summary. But I want to say something about another country that we tend to be neglecting, and that is China. Very soon, it is not impossible that we'll be replacing France with China. Last week I was in Addis, and I heard a story that I found extremely depressing. As we all know, the African Union headquarters in Addis was built by the Chinese. But I heard the very disturbing news that when the AU wanted to entertain and welcome the Japanese Prime Minister at that head office, China said they can't. Interestingly, there were some Chinese at the meeting because the meeting also involved China, and the Chinese representative there said, "You will find out," but tentatively he offered an apology. What is important is not the apology or the lack of it. It is the fact that there's a major problem that we need to look at. So that's just the little I have to add to that. Mshai, thank you very much again for letting us know about what the ALC is doing with the policy world. And again, thanks to Fumi for leading that. You see, I've said this a number of times. Okay. Godwin, thank you in absentia. But I've always said something about this, and again, I think I should say it here. There's always a gap between the academic and the practitioner in any field. The academic is thinking to a conclusion. The practitioner is taking to a decision. The academic has the luxury of deciding what to think. The practitioner is thinking of what to do. All these involve different mental processes. The academic goes in search of problems. The practitioner has the problem right in front of him. And if at the ALC we can do one or two things to bridge that gap, I think we'll have actually added something to the quality of scholarship, leadership, and policy world in Africa. Thank you very much.
Excellently done. We have between 15 and probably still a couple of minutes, depending on the contributions for questions, comments, and discussions. I have nothing to add because I think that you guys usually have a lot more interesting comments and questions than I, as the chair, can sort of add to this. So please, you know the rule, make it as concise as possible so that this is a conversation or discussion that can sort of circulate. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so we'll take the round of 4 first, and if we have any time, we'll add more. So first.
Thank you, Professor Boubacar, for the role of France. You discussed about France being a neo-colonial power in the 21st century. I totally agree with you. Take into consideration the role of Jacques Foucault, who was called Mr. Africa. He was typically deciding kind of head of state, kind of regime. But I also expected you to discuss about the role of African head of state. You look at the role of Houphouët Boigny in the assassination of Thomas Sankara. You look at the role of Blaise Compaoré in the destabilization of Roland Gbagbo's regime. My question here is, if the African head of state decide to work together, are they compelled to run their various states at the behest of France? That's the first question. The second question, Gbagbo Laurent, he wasn't really a democratic leader in the sense of the word. But why did Gbagbo decide to oppose France while he knew opposing France is against his personal interests as head of state? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Pastor Mike, next gentleman.
Hello, I'm Tari Ajadi, and I'm a visiting student with the African Leadership Center. My comment is directed to Dr. Mwangola. I just wanted to say that I loved your presentation, and I was wondering to what extent new media is effective in actually targeting new policy measures, because often I find that there's this attempt at bringing in, these different methodologies, Twitter, et cetera, into targeting, I guess, populations that might not be involved, yet it doesn't often work out. So I was wondering how effective you think it could be with the Leadership Center.
Okay, and then Ismail. So,
thank you. To all three presenters, Mshai, really a very interesting paper also on the methodology of working together, of getting right. I think that as it can be very important also for us in South Africa to learn lessons from how you do this leadership training, the mentorship thing, and how you work with your students. So I do hope we will get a copy of that paper. Very interesting. And to Cheryl, just one question. Cheryl, to what extent, despite all the problems that you have pointed out around SADC, what role does it play? The fact that the governments of the member states basically do not want to see a very successful regional organization. The fact that they very often consider a regional organization to be a threat to the old things of sovereignty, etc. I'm just curious to know how you feel about it, because I think we've got plenty of evidence around several countries, including South Africa, that there's almost a lip service commitment, but very careful around handing over power or authority or decision-making abilities, genuinely so, to these regional organizations.
Thank you very much. Wale?
Thank you. My question goes to Professor Ndiaye. Thanks for updating our knowledge on France. I think I've listened to you on this team for quite a while. but it's good to see your reflection on some of the more recent events, especially the road to Cameroon via Paris. The issues I wanted to raise is just, hopefully maybe you could just clarify. The first one, I think Dr. Alao has hinted at it, which is in relation to China. How is the entry of China into some traditionally French areas of influence or spheres of influence, how is it changing or is it impacting on French policy as well as French activities? It's quite interesting that in some of the troubled or politically volatile regions of Africa, some of them, including Francophone states, what you find is active Chinese presence in those places. So how is that changing France's political and security calculus in those environments, and also economic? That's one. The second one is about France's use of bilateral as well as multilateral strategies in its African engagement. In as much as I think I agree completely that the manifestations and impact of French activities in Africa has not changed, even if the world and many other things have changed in that time frame. It seems that their use, or the balance between the use of bilateral as well as multilateral strategies appear to have changed, or there might be some tweaking by France. But I would love to get your overview of that.
Yeah, thank you. Any more? Okay, last one.
Thank you. My question goes to Prof. Boubacar also. When the Ukraine crisis was trending in the media, I immediately also thought about France when Russia was being accused of trying to grab land. The only difference I found between France and Russia was that France did his so many years ago. As a scholar and as a policy analyst, do you feel the UN has done enough for Francophone countries in terms of trying to protect their sovereignty and integrity in the midst of the aggression from France and their willingness to intervene and disrupt political processes in African countries? Do you think the UN has done enough? And do you think there's the possibility for UN to do something for Francophone countries? And if that's likely to be successful?
Thank you very much. I think we've got a very good round of questions, and I'll turn to the presenters. Mshai, Boubacar, and Cherly. You are the only thing that stands now between the session and break. So I'll ask you guys.
No pressure.
No pressure at all. I'll ask all of you one at a time to respond to the various comments and questions that have come up. And I'll start again in reverse order. Mshai, you go first. And then Boubacar and Cherly. You can use the mic if you want.
Okay, great question. This is a part of where we are. I'll start with Maxi because yours is the easier one. We are hoping to be able to do that. We have begun documenting. I think for me, again, part of my fascination was when I came in last year and we began talking about it, was we were talking about the research working group, and I was trying to understand the methodology. And then Alfred just said, oh, you know, Fumi once wrote this up for us because we were all trying to understand it. And then he produced this beautifully written up thing. So then I began to think, wow, it would be wonderful if we can make that available. So that's part of what we're trying to do, is to figure our way out of it and then write it up. And we'd love any other models that people have to be able to share that. So we'll put it in the paper as well. And then Tari, that's part of what we're trying to find out in social media. Last year, I did a lot of listening, especially when the APN grantees were here, but also listening to the alumni, the fellows as they came along. And one thing we kept hearing was, why aren't we using social media more as academics? And I think two things I have begun to see, and I've now begun to do it myself, but also to follow, is that often if you tweet and tweet in real time, and there are a number of you, and you have a hashtag, you start to have conversations with people. So for instance, when I was in Arusha, somebody tweeted and said to me, can I be part of these conversations? I'll send you my work, can we get the paper? And this was happening even as the conference was going on because of things we were tweeting. The other thing that I realized, I'm new to all of this, so I didn't even know how to do Storyfy. But the person we had, now this is, she came in saying, I don't know very much about this, but she said, can I do a Storyfy out of it? Apart from the tweets of what was going on in the conference, she then went and searched up media stories happening in East Africa and linked them to the relevant tweets. And then she said, you know, we could also do podcasts and link them to the Storyfy. So you have another way of documenting it. But then, for younger people, there is a group of people who actually would read that and not read your traditional news stories, not read your traditional accounts. So when we start to think about how do we create these spaces of conversation so that in the public sphere, people are starting to get what it is we are saying. Something that was raised to us when we had the media conference was they said academics need to learn to speak in bite-sized chunks. And Twitter forces you to do that. So even today, I've been trying to get the bite-sized chunks where somebody says a lot of amazing things, but then I ask, can I capture that in 140 characters? And that's the kind of thing that media looks for. We haven't yet begun to look at the impact. It's just something that we are beginning to think about how can we do it, and maybe that could be another model that would add to the plate. Thank you.
Yeah, I certainly hate to stand between the crowd and coffee, so I'll make it brief. On China, and to couple Alao and Wale's comments on this. Yeah, clearly China has become a major actor on the African scene for reasons you all know. And again, that does pose a problem to France and to other Western powers whose hunting ground Africa was supposed to be. And certainly France starts to feel the heat. Not that France itself is not going to China to do business with it, but certainly it must not be very happy with China encroaching as much on its territory. And that's something that Africans should follow and should, and certainly our leaders have already started to leverage that. Now, is it for the interest of our people? That's another matter. But clearly, China is emerging now as the, to use a famous phrase, the geopolitical and strategic foe for France in this case. Now, allow me to say that Chinese are way too sophisticated to bluntly say, well, we give you this building, but you cannot welcome Japanese or Mongolians, or I don't think they would do that. I would seriously doubt that's the case. Now, it should be a matter of shame for every single African that on this continent we cannot find enough resources to build a building where we not have to contend with rumors like this one here. But yeah, every time I go to Addis, I cringe when I see that building. I don't care if it's the Chinese or the Germans or the Brits. Nobody should have built that building for the AU. Now, yes, Boubacar was what used to be called Monsieur Afrique. He basically was the overlord over Francophone African countries. All the interventions that I mentioned in passing, just a few, he is responsible for it. He came back on the scene under Chirac in the 1990s, did exactly the same thing. Now, you're right, France could not do what it did without the complicity of a number of heads of states. Some of them much more infamous than others. Houphouët-Boigny and Blaise Compaoré are clearly cases in point. Now, if they all came together, would they be able to change the givens of the Franco-African relations? I suspect yes. But again, unfortunately, African leaders have not shown any capacity to do any of that. And despite the fact that things have changed, France continued to run roughshod on our peoples. As far as Gbagbo, well, I will not go too far on this because it's a very complex situation. But Gbagbo did not counter French's interest. Gbagbo was as serviceable to the French as any in Cote d'Ivoire. What Gbagbo was interested in more than anything else, and this my Cameroonian friends do not get, and some Anglophone countries do not get. Gbagbo was interested in one thing only, that is power for Mr. Gbagbo, and the spoil that come with it. So this hype about this grand nationalist that was taken down by France is really hype. It's not true. Gbagbo has changed the minute he schemed to come to power in 2000, and he didn't want to leave. That was his problem. It's not France. He gave France everything it wanted, but he didn't want to leave power when he lost the election. That is his problem. France's calculus, again, has certainly changed, to go back to what you said as far as China. But it still is dealing with very weak states, very divided states, very vulnerable states, and it will keep pulling its strings and safeguarding its interests. Those have not changed, despite all the changes that have occurred. As far as the Ukraine crisis, I'm not sure you really can draw any close comparison. The situation is completely different. France right now has no aspiration on any land on the continent. It certainly wouldn't mind having people who would do its bidding, but it will never think about grabbing any land. And I know you didn't say that, but the situations are completely different. Last point, still with the friend who spoke about the UN and Francophone African countries. The UN is what it is. It is run by 5 countries. Whatever happens as far as these countries, the UN is beholden to what those 5 countries decide on their own. And they just basically bargain among themselves to safeguard their interests. The UN is not interested at all and is not equipped to do anything for anybody, certainly not Francophone African countries. What happened at the UN is decided by those 2, if it has any consequence at all, it is decided by those 5 countries. Until things change, that will not change. So the answer is no, the UN is not doing anything for Francophone African countries. It has no vocation of doing it, it cannot do it. France will use the UN to do what it wants. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Firstly, to respond to Dr. Lau's comment about outside pressure and perhaps that leading to the technocratic approach of SADC. So the SADC organ actually does not allow donors to sponsor the work of the organ, which is also a very interesting thing about SADC. It can sponsor work on peace building, but not peacemaking and peacekeeping. Haven't we been part of the attempt to draft that CEPO 2? I knew that wasn't donor pressure leading them to the kind of interventions that it came up with. It was political. They really didn't want to engage in the debate of what to do. Certainly context predetermines the way in which SADC operates. And in the paper I mentioned that right from the beginning of the frontline states, the pressure of South Africa, the rise of the Cold War in which many Southern African states are engaged, civil wars in their own countries, and that structures the way in which SADC begins to operate. And I think that very structural, the logic of that negates transformation. I think that was the point I was trying to make in the paper. So yes, Maxi, SADC I don't think ever conceived of a very strong and supranational body. And that is why its directorate is so weak, because it's weak in specific areas. When it wants to do something, as with the SADC Standby Brigade, it puts all its resources and its energy there, and it delivers on that. When it is really hesitant about something, it's not going to do its resources, put its resources there. And I think here in particular about the national committees, for example, because these are supposed to be the spaces in which governments and civil society interacted at national level, and then that should feed up to SADC. Those structures never ever took place. It wasn't interested in doing that. And so it operates in the way in which it does. I do want to end off simply by noting these conversations that I think we should be having. Conversations about how to bring about transformation, rather than merely critiquing what has happened, because we really need to be shifting our discussion there, I think. The conversations around what is it that we want, and then how to get there. Around different actors. We simply just label non-state actors. What are these different kinds of actors in different kinds of spaces? What are these different kinds of solutions that can be generated? How do we get to identifying local challenges and local solutions, and not just national political solutions as well?
Please join me in giving all of the presenters, the discussants, and those who raised questions and comments a big hand.